We all have games we can't finish that someone else could. Even the most hardcore cringe gamers, TM, have a game that was so bullshit hard that they quit instead of just getting good. There exist games that no one would play and say, yes, this is tuned correctly. But in that same breath, there are people who enjoy playing those exact games. There are also games that we just don't have the time to dedicate to gaining the skills of. I'm not here to make an argument against having easy modes in games or hard modes in games, kind of. So then, what am I here to do? I'm here to talk about difficulty in games, and more importantly, why games should not have any difficulties at all. Now, I just pissed off everyone at once. The people who came here wanting easier difficulties are mad at me, and people who like games that cause them to break their controller are mad at me too. If you want to click off, please feel free. However, this video is meant to help you both understand something. So, I guess, let's get into it. What is difficulty? Seems like a philosophical question, but I'm serious. I've played games where the hardest difficulty is easier than the second hardest. I've played games where the easiest difficulty is a rage fiesta. I've played games with sliders, accessibility options, easy gameplay but impossible trophies, and many, many other games with many, many more ways of encompassing difficulty. This is the first reason why I said games shouldn't have difficulty. That's because difficulty is arbitrary. Adding a stealth mechanic in a shooting game can vastly increase the difficulty of that game, even if the stealth is relatively easy. Why? Because FPS players aren't inherently good at stealth. That's not to say they're inherently bad, but the difficulty of a shooting game can be raised by adding mechanics that shooters aren't inherently known for. Not just the normal things you'd think of, like less HP, more accurate enemies, or less ammo. So let's say you now have a game where the hardest difficulty forces you into the most stealth situations. Except, what about the people who are stealth gods? People who suck at shooting but excel at stealth. The game just became much easier for that group of people and harder for another. And potentially, there's been no change in difficulty for a group of people who are equal at both. But the devs called one hard and the other easy. Did they lie? No. We'll cover that more in depth later. For now, let's just say that difficulty had a weird meaning to it. That was a theoretical example, but let's talk about a real example. Persona 5 Royal. Persona 5 is an amazing game, generally loved by the public. I loved it too, and I also love playing on the hardest difficulty. So I picked Merciless. My fiance likes a challenge, but doesn't like to get upset at games, so she picked hard. The issue with that, as it turns out, is that there are fights that are nearly impossible on hard that are breezes in Merciless. While the rest of the game is considered harder for a bunch of different reasons, there is a caveat that some things are easier. Normally, you'd expect raising the difficulty to make everything, well, more difficult. All aspects of gameplay should be at least the same, if not harder the next level up. It's just not the case in all games. So I ask again, what is difficulty? The last thing I want to talk about on this point before answering it is a game without difficulty. A game without difficulty has difficulty. A game will get harder or easier as time goes on. I want to point out one of the most egregious examples of a difficult game, Jak 2. Games like Jak 2, which are considered bullshit hard for some missions, is harder in certain areas than other. If you play Jak 2, I can tell you exactly how to beat each mission with only a moderate level of discomfort. If you play it from start to finish with no knowledge, however, there will be times when you want to rip out your hair and throw your controller. This game is generally considered to be tuned way too high for certain missions. The reality is, the difficulty comes from the lack of direction. Most missions have a gun that needs to be used to make it easy. They just don't say that. The point of these stories is to help answer the question at the beginning of the section. What is the difficulty? The answer is simple. There isn't one. It's just different settings the developer has to change to make the game less completable than each rising difficulty. Difficulty means different things to different people, and asking for harder or easier difficulties is useless because of the next point. Difficulty is difficult. Most people won't know that. Why would they? The vast majority of the human race hasn't had to tweak the difficulty of anything. I'm not using that as a shot against you. I'm just trying to explain it so you understand where we're going. So first, let me show you what making a difficult game can be like in simple terms. I want to talk about the difficulty of the game of Sudoku puzzles. If you don't know what a Sudoku puzzle is, I'll give a quick explanation. It's this: a box filled with 9 boxes stacked 3 by 3, where each box is filled with 9 boxes stacked 3 by 3. The goal of the game is to fill each one of the bigger boxes with the numbers 1 through 9. Each one of the bigger boxes can only have one instance of 1 through 9 in it, and each row and column can only have one instance of 1 and 9 through it. The game starts with a certain number of boxes already filled in, and then the player, following those rules, fills in the rest to get a full Sudoku. Here's an example of an easy puzzle, here's a medium, and lastly a hard. Pretty simple, right? Just remove more numbers, easy clap, let's go! Add easy mode to all games. Wrong. Sudoku puzzles can only be solved one way, and making a puzzle that can only have one solution that doesn't lead to being impossible is incredibly difficult. Removing the wrong number could lead to multiple solutions, and worse, you will have 2 clues for 2 different solutions in the same puzzle. Meaning if you follow one clue and then the other clue somewhere else, you will end up locking out any solutions, because the 2 clues that lead to 2 different solutions make the puzzle impossible to solve. For example, any Sudoku puzzle that starts with 16 digits will have multiple solutions. It's impossible to have a single solution when that puzzle only has 16 digits. Having as many as 77 digits will still have the possibility of multiple solutions if the puzzle is set up incorrectly. And a Sudoku puzzle isn't a true puzzle without a unique solution. You can have as many as 77 digits present and still not have a solvable Sudoku puzzle. And that's double the amount of digits that would normally be associated with an easy Sudoku puzzle. Wow, that's a lot of talk about Sudoku puzzles in a video about video game difficulties. What the hell is he talking about? I'm trying to point out that even in a game as simple as Sudoku, making a working puzzle can be very difficult. Now apply that to a game of a much grander scale. How do you tune each and every enemy to make the experience still fun? I don't just mean in one direction either. Have you ever played a game that had a God mode in it? The game gets boring. Let someone play The Sims when they have to start from scratch, first when they have infinite money, max stats, and no needs ever present. One person will play for a day at most. The other could play for a lifetime. Here, you've made the game as easy as possible, and it sucks. It's very difficult to tune a fight. It's always so much harder than we realize, and it's all relative. This brings me to a new argument that's popped up in recent years that I will cover briefly. Accessibility options in games for the gamers with disabilities. I've only seen it come up in 3 separate occasions. The first is when a game implements them. It gets praised. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. You should always applaud what you want to see in a game when it comes out. The second is when a popular gamer with a diagnosed disability discusses the specific difficulties they face when playing games. This is wonderful because these are the testimonies you want to hear. It truly helps gaming companies that have the capacity to make these features create better experiences for everyone. The final occurrence, however, is the one that taints the well, and the one I see the most. If the only time you ever really see an article about accessibility in games is when reviewers or games journalists have trouble beating a game, that's so fucking gross. First of all, the absolute audacity to assume that they're better at gaming than every person with disabilities. The fact that they need to beat the drum of accessibility to justify them not being able to beat it spits in the face of decency. It shows such a deranged misunderstanding about what actually avails gamers with disabilities. The issue with this is just because a game is hard for them doesn't mean it's hard for an individual with disabilities. Going even further than this, just because a game is easy for them doesn't mean it's easy for someone with disabilities. A visual novel with no large text option or a text-to-speech option for an individual who is legally blind or has dyslexia will almost always be impossible to complete. A simple color matching game with no color blindness mode will be infinitely harder for a colorblind person than a Souls game is. However, you don't hear games media going to map for those kinds of games very often, do you? I wonder why that is. I don't, actually. It's because they want to use the argument to justify being angry at a game's difficulty without being called out on being paid to play a video game as a profession, but lacking the skills to do so. Once again, I'm not here to ridicule your playstyle or your skill level. Everyone is allowed to think a game is too hard. Skill level shouldn't be something publicly demonized. However, when someone makes that argument, it's almost always in a way that's just using people, and that's not what it should be about. Making a game fun or accessible is a lot more than just adding or removing health for enemies. I've heard things like no game was made worse with sliders in this argument, but how is that supposed to directly help someone with disabilities? Having difficulty pressing controls? An issue. Having audio cues? An issue. Having color specific cues? An issue. A monster that can one-shot you? Not an issue. Being bad at games isn't a disability. And it shows that most people's solutions don't actually ever help people with disabilities, just people who are bad at games. A lot of thought needs to go into accessibility options, and for more reasons than just bringing enjoyment or allowing completion. There is a penultimate reason more important than any other that games should not have difficulty settings. This is why I love games and why you love games, believe it or not. Games are a medium for a story. Just like movies, books, poetry, art, songs, and so on. They are generally considered the least sophisticated form of storytelling when compared to the rest. The only people who don't think this are people who love video games. Go figure. Even with that being the case though, most people who like video games don't believe they are the most sophisticated way to convey a story. For the most part, people are right in thinking that. Each media has its ups and downs. Video games rarely use their most important tool for standing out when it comes to storytelling. How can you feel the post-apocalypse vibe of The Last of Us? Reduce the amount of materials you find to basically nothing, making a player have to scrounge up each and every scrap of material they can find, barely having enough ammo or duct tape in a single level to do anything, let alone survive. This makes sense too, because it's been years since the outbreak happened. Grounded difficulty does this well, easy does not. Do you want your players to understand why your character forsook his honor? Make head-on fights extremely lethal and make it so that stealth gets the job done much cleaner. Ghost of Tsushima does this well in higher difficulties by making head-on fights lethal. Lower difficulties, it does not. How can you make a player understand how hard it is to gain control of a mythical monster? You can make the controls confusing and difficult to master, leading to an easier and easier time as the game progresses, but a large learning curve at the beginning. Replicating the bond you start to form with your animal companion. That's how The Last Guardian helps you form bonds with your companion even though it has no difficulty. Does a developer want the player to feel like they can take on the world? This is rarely achieved by having a game that can be completed from start to finish by someone unfamiliar with the game and have no issues. No, this is achieved by making every single enemy a threat. Because it's not just the major hurdles that life throws at you that can get in your way. It's the small everyday things that can get you if you're not careful. And this is the case with Elden Ring. Difficulty is a powerful tool. It can show a player so much more than a movie can. It can help a person understand something more fundamentally than a book can. It's just almost never used properly. Most developers use difficulty to make a game more fun to play. But not all deep and meaningful movies are fun to watch. Not every ground-shaking book is fun to read. They can be heart-wrenching, confusing, or be a downright trudge to get through for some people. Some of the absolute best books can be seen as absolute garbage by a large number of people who read and watch them. The thing is, those people generally understand they're not supposed to get it. When you were in high school and you were forced to read Slaughterhouse-Five or insert just any other meaningful book that was a fucking shit show to read as a teen here, you probably thought it was crap, with good reason. Most teens don't understand the horrors of war, or the experience of hopping around seems jarring and unwarranted. That doesn't mean it is, though. Just because most teens and a fair amount of adults don't give a shit about Shakespeare doesn't mean he's not one of the greatest storytellers of all time. Difficulty has the ability to convey themes of storytelling that no other form of media can. A book can't convey how hard something is effectively. A movie cannot successfully convey how hard a task is. A game can. And the fact that most of the time it is just written off by games media as a game is too hard and needs an easy mode is an insult to gaming as a medium. In the first ever video I did on this channel, don't watch it, it has terrible audio quality.
Cultivation is difficult.
I talk about how a video game uses difficulty to make the player unconsciously side with the people who wronged you in the first place without even realizing it. The game wouldn't have been as good if it was easier. It might be more accessible, and it might even be more fun to play for a wider audience, but it wouldn't have had a better impact. I still think about that game today. I have played hundreds of games over my lifetime. I can't remember much about a lot of them. The ones I do, though, are usually criticized for not getting it right. Of the 4 games I mentioned earlier, one of them doesn't seem like it belongs, but it has had the greatest impact on me. That is The Last Guardian. The Last Guardian is a game that is lost in time. Because its graphics weren't the best when it came out, the developers had 10 years to make it, and the controlling of the beast was wonky at best. So why am I grouping it with arguably some of the greatest games of our time? More importantly, why am I discussing it in the last few minutes of a game about difficulty? Why not monologue about Elden Ring and farm those likes, views, and subs? Because the moment I realized the difficulty I was having controlling Toriko was going down as I became more attached to him changed my life. None of the negative reviews mattered. The 10 years the developers had spent making the game were justified. The graphics were pointless in comparison to that moment. So what does this have to do with difficulty? If you had made Toriko easier to control the entire time, the game would have been more fun, and the game would have been shit. If you had made Toriko harder to control the entire time, the game would have been more difficult and the game would have been shit. While not every game has to be some impactful, meaningful story, the devs have an idea. They have a vision that they want to fulfill, and sometimes you cannot fulfill that vision when you change the difficulty. Again, The Last of Us, the story hits harder in a harder difficulty. That doesn't mean the game isn't fun in lower difficulties. That doesn't mean that people don't have emotional connections with Ellie in lower difficulties. But the game all around hits harder, and sometimes the difficulty is so connected to the core of the game that having other difficulties doesn't make sense. Ghost of Tsushima is a fun game, and it can stand on 2 legs in any difficulty. But that core tenet of the story doesn't. That loss of honor makes no sense. You can fight the entire game head on and still win. Yet for some reason you've sacrificed your honor. That doesn't make sense in low difficulties. It doesn't translate correctly. It only translates correctly in a difficulty that's high enough that you have to stealth in. And again, that's not saying that the game is not fun. It's how the game's best form is presented. And if a company wants to sacrifice that vision to make sure the most amount of people can play it and it gets in the most hands, that's fine. But don't fault games that stick to their vision. And don't force a game that sticks to its vision to change. The point of this video is to convince you that games shouldn't have difficulty. I don't know if I've convinced you. I probably haven't, I gotta be honest. The truth is, you either think games are meant to be fun, or you think games can be so much more than fun. If you want games to be fun and nothing more, I love and appreciate you, because we will always need fun games. And I know you're not the ones demanding games to be easier. If you dismiss difficulty as some kind of bullshit that gamers TM use to pat themselves on the back, then you will never truly understand what makes video games great. You will never see difficulty for what it truly is. And whenever you run into frustrating obstacles, you will lash out at the developer or give up, and never ask yourself what the game is trying to actually accomplish in that moment by making you frustrated. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.